The Awakened King DLC added a few weapons, 3 guns and 4 melee weapons. How they fare on Apocalypse is what we're here to find out. Starting with the guns is Monarch. This long gun is very unique. It's a boss weapon with a mod, but it functions entirely different from every other weapon in the game. For starters, there's no listed mod cost. In fact, you can just toggle the mod on and off whenever you want. And this doesn't proc anything that works off of mod activation. Upon activation, the next shot fired will launch a harpoon. This sticks to surfaces and enemies alike. As long as the harpoon is stuck wherever it may be, every shot fired from the weapon will home into its location. You can look up, down, left to right, hide around a corner. As long as these shots don't physically hit a wall, they will hit their target. This is really powerful. It's essentially auto-aim. You can launch a harpoon into an enemy's weak spot, and every shot you fire off is probably going to hit there. It's worth noting that the harpoon does actually deal damage. It can even weak spot hit, although it doesn't seem to have any sort of weak spot modifier, but it doesn't really need it. So you got a weapon that auto-aims for you, at the slight cost of a 15% damage penalty. Once you do start landing shots when it's homing, you'll build up this little bar. This is the actual mod power of the mod. Once the mod is fully charged, the next shot fired will activate Chains of Command. This is the part that procs on mod activation sources. Chains of Command automatically reloads your weapon, increases your weapon damage by 20%, and grants unlimited reserve ammo for 20 seconds. This 20% damage boost is still fighting the 15% damage reduction you gain from the shots being homing, so it's effectively only a 5% damage boost. There's also a little shockwave that comes out, but I barely noticed it doing anything half the time. I don't know if it's because I was fighting the Fey flying guys, although even with grounded targets, the damage is very hit or miss. When it does connect, the damage can actually be kinda good, although it does seem to sort of taper off the further away enemies are. Regardless, the mod is still very good. Not needing to physically see the target you're aiming for is invaluable. Combined with the free reload and unlimited reserve ammo, just makes it a very good mod. Like with other weapons whose mod is just a buff to the gun, it's amazing. You don't have to worry about building for mod damage, although the mod does benefit from various sources, like mod power generation and mod cost reductions. Unfortunately, mod duration does not affect the buff. The weapon card does update its numbers, but it'll always last 20 seconds. If the mod were actually affected by sources that increase mod duration, that would be incredible. The only real issue I have with the weapon, besides the odd shockwave, is that sometimes, very rarely, when swapping back from the harpoon, your shots just won't fire until you let go of the trigger and press it again. For the build, I wanted to go with the theme of auto-aiming. Either of the first 2 engineer skills pretty much fit that bill. To get more use out of the mod, I decided to run Gunslinger so I could pick up Bulletstorm. If we can't increase the duration via mod duration sources, we might as well just fire and reload the gun quicker. For trinkets, I went with Nightweaver's Grudge, Atonement Fold, Ring of Infinite Damage, Probability Cord, and Xania's Malice. For the Mutator, I think that Bullet Weaver is honestly the perfect match for it. The 20% boost to fire rate applies for 75% of the weapon's buff. I also invested into Flashcaster and Potency to help the activation of the mod go a little faster, and to make buffs like Rocket Fuel last a little longer. I have to say, this weapon is up there. Granted, I know I'm running a lot of meta here with everything, but even still, this weapon kicks ass. Watch how fast I absolutely annihilate Annihilation in his first phase. Being able to get multiple magazines out during the mod's duration makes this thing an absolute beast. Yeah, you're still gonna get higher burst damage out of something like Crescent Moon, or any of the bows for that matter, but its ease of use and non-reliance on something like building for mod damage lends it to be useful in all sorts of builds. If you haven't tried it out yet, I implore you to do so. Monarch is absolutely Apocalypse ready. Moving on, we have Sparkfire. It's a pretty basic weapon, all things considered. It's a lever-action shotgun with kind of similar stats to the scattergun. The main draw here is the built-in fire dot, and its open mod slot. Sometimes less is more. This weapon could have totally had some sort of built-in mod, but its lack of one actually opens it up to a lot more builds. Before moving on to the setup I used, there's a few more differences between this and the scattergun I'd like to point out. The first is reload speed. The Sparkfire reloads noticeably faster than the scattergun. combined with the higher rate of fire than that of the scattergun, and this weapon can put out some seriously good DPS. Without the dot being considered, the scattergun does beat it for raw damage. A way of visualizing the weapon is that it took 90 damage from the scattergun and converted it into a dot. If you don't plan on investing into elemental damage or dots, then the scattergun is probably going to be better for you. But if you do want to invest into dot damage and duration, this weapon can be really good. It also fires 9 pellets, whereas the scattergun fires 7. Like most shotguns, this can cause you to lose out on some damage, although I find investing into handling is usually enough to deal with it. This is the setup I used: Miasma, Rampage, Talisman of the Sun, Singed Ring, Ahane Crystal, Burden of the Destroyer, and Timekeeper's Jewel. For the modded mutator, I went with Corrosive Rounds and Maelstrom. Miasma and Maelstrom is pretty much a match made in heaven. I considered throwing on Twisted Wounds or something else, but I figured I'm already going with Miasma, I don't really need 2 stacks of bleeding dots. I often forget just how strong Ritualist's prime perk is. I went through the chimney with it, and every time I killed one of the basic little root guys, every single enemy would get that dot on them. That kind of speaks to how strong this is with mobbing, although that could be said of a lot of Ritualist builds. When it comes to bossing, god damn is this powerful. Just watch how I absolutely destroy both Huntress and Custodian's Eye. When I got to the end of both of them, I was like, wait, that's it? They're already dead? Part of this is definitely due to the insane dots from Ritualist and, I'm assuming, Nebula's mod. 300 corrosive dot ticks is, something. I think this might just be my new favorite shotgun, period. Unless they add one more in the DLCs, I don't think this can be beaten. It's definitely apocalypse ready. Moving on to the last gun, we have Anguish. And when the DLC first released, yeah, that name was pretty accurate to how it felt to use the weapon. But with the weapon now properly scaling, it's actually really good. It's a shotgun charge weapon hybrid. If you tap fire, it's a shotgun. It fires 6 pellets out that actually bounce on the environment, and there's no built-in damage reduction like there is with Astral Burst. Not that you should really be going for trick shots, as cool as they may be. If you hold down the trigger but don't fully charge it, you'll tighten the shotgun spread. This can be kind of useful, but if you're trying to actually go for the charge shots, it can be a bit annoying if you can't get the timing right. The way I see it, if you're charging the weapon at all, you might as well go for the fully charged shot. When the weapon is fully charged, it fires out a slug. This slug plants a bomb on whatever it hits, which detonates after 2 seconds. The impact of said slug actually deals fire damage. The blast radius of the slug isn't marked on the weapon card, but it feels like a few meters. I did invest into amplitude to see if it would affect the weapon at all. Unfortunately, it doesn't benefit the blast radius. The same also applies to its mod. And before I forget, charging up the weapon converts your health into gray health. This conversion can't kill you, but it does add up over time. If you are charging the weapon, that is. This can be counteracted by running either Bloodstream or Tranquil Heart. Moving on to the mod, Loathe the Weak is actually really interesting. On paper, the damage seems very low. However, the mod actually has a hidden stat. As the name would imply, the mod actually does increased damage against weaker targets. The formula looks something like this. Basically, as whatever you're fighting gets lower on health, the mod deals increased damage, up to double damage when the enemies are at 5% HP. There's also no real mag size to the mod, meaning the higher fire rate you have, the more damage you can output per mod activation. This weapon has a lot going for it. Did I mention the mod cost is only 500 base? That is super cheap. For a comparison, Astral Burst costs 450, and it hits about as hard as a wet napkin. I digress. There's a lot of builds you could make for this weapon. In my patch notes video, I basically made a caveman build where you just spam fire the basic shotgun blast. That setup is actually very effective, as the damage is just a little lower than the double barrel. For this video, I decided on building for the mod. Archon Summoner. The skills don't really matter, you can pick whichever ones you want. Gold Ribbon, Ring of Infinite Damage, Shard Branded Ring, Burden of the Gambler, and Burden of the Destroyer. And once again, I went with Bullet Weaver. For this setup, I think it's perfect. Just like with Monarch, we want to get out as many shots as possible before the mod ends. Just like with Monarch, any sources that increase mod duration do not affect Loathe the Weak. So how does the build fare? Well, at the start of fights, it can feel a little weaker, but you have that increasing damage as the fight goes on. Since the mod is so cheap, it's super easy to build up. while it may not melt bosses, it's incredibly consistent. And since it only gets better as the fights go on, around that halfway point, you're going to start to see the damage ramp up really fast. Probably the best fight to bring this weapon into is Corruptor. Since the boss starts with a large chunk of health missing, you're immediately getting a big boost to your mod damage. Seriously, like 2 or 3 bursts is all you need to kill this guy. I can only imagine what a full team of 3 guys using this would actually look like. Before I move on, there are a few small issues I want to talk about with the gun. The first is the bomb from the primary fire. Sometimes, depending on the surface, it actually won't deal any damage to anything near it when it explodes. Shoot the ground in the targeting range and you'll see what I mean. It's not a super big issue. You're not often going to place a short-lived mine around a corner as a trap for an enemy. If you activate the mod when your magazine is empty, you'll actually lose a few seconds of the mod, being forced to reload the weapon. The last one is more of a slight annoyance. The individual explosions from the mod can pretty easily stunlock you. This only happens if an enemy gets right in your face as you're blasting him with it, so as a tip, try not to do that, but sometimes it's already too late. Anguish is certainly apocalypse ready. And lastly, we have the melee weapons. There's not really a whole ton to say about them, although I will cover 2 of them in a little detail. The first of which being Abyssal Hook. It has incredible fashion, and the little jingle-jangle of the chains whenever you swing it around is really good. Its mod is Fathomless Deep. Basically, charge attacks increase your stagger damage by 10% up to 3 times for 5 seconds. This is not very noticeable, and the main reason why is because the weapon already has an innate 80% increased stagger damage. 30% more doesn't really do much. It's essentially like hitting an enemy with World's Edge. Come to think of it, the stats actually look a little familiar. Huh. Bet you didn't realize I just showed you the stats of 3 different weapons, huh? I'm not sure why. The stats for both Abyssal Hook and Wrathbringer are just copy-pasted from World's Edge. I don't know if this is intentional at all, as that makes both Wrathbringer and Abyssal Hook way better than either of the other hammers. Like, why would you run any of the base game hammers now, when both this one and Wrathbringer just have way better stats? I am not saying to nerf either of these. If anything, bring the other 3 up to their level. Move over, Stonebreaker. Wrathbringer is the new head honcho. Its mod, Awakening, increases your melee damage by 5% up to 10 times every time you take damage. The stacks last for 10 seconds. As you gain more stacks, there's a really cool visual effect that grows around the hammer. The easiest way to accumulate stacks is to apply some sort of self-damage. Atonement Fold is basically your best option. It's a low damage, infinite duration dot that will always keep you at maximum stacks. This hammer does insane damage. This is the setup I ran. I'm not going to really go into detail. You can take any sort of build from my melee video and use it here. Man, who would have thought a hammer with a 50% damage increase mod would be just absolutely better than every other weapon in its category. Really makes Atom Smasher, not look very good. Since both of these weapons are just statistically way better than either of the other hammers, they are by default apocalypse ready. Lastly, we have the scythes, and there's really nothing to say about them. The moveset is the exact same as it was in Remnant 1. This is one of the few cases where the base version is actually better than the special variation. Ritualist Scythe deals 10% more damage against targets that have a negative status on them. That sounds all fine and dandy, until you realize it basically has almost 10% less damage than the Steel Scythe, and the Steel Scythe has 5% more crit chance. This is going to be getting changed soon, I'm sure. It just needs to either scale with multiple status effects, or make its base effect like 25-30%. And that's all the weapons in the Awakened King DLC. Most of them are really good. I'm sure we'll be seeing some balance changes going into the second DLC that might affect some of these weapons. Either way, I think the DLC's weapons are a pretty good addition to the roster. Let me know which weapon from the DLC is your favorite. And next time we'll be covering the first batch of the corrupted weapons. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.